Hello and welcome to the Distinction Podcast. So this podcast is all about bridging the gap between academic research and management practice, and it's about finding ways to bring insights from high quality academic research into everyday practices as HR managers and leaders. So we've run 2 sessions of the podcast so far. In the first session, we looked at leadership and remote teams. In the second session, we looked at optimizing team performance. And today is all about decision making. We've also got sessions in the pipeline on wellbeing and strategy, and they're all available on YouTube, and very soon they'll be available on your favorite podcast app. So keep an eye out, that's coming soon. So my name's Dani. My background's in organisation and people change. I spent 6 years as Director of People at Investors in People, and I now run my own consultancy practice. So I've always been fascinated by watching how decision making unfolds in organisations. It's such an important part of what makes organisations tick and how they get things done. But it's really rare to find leaders and teams that have given much thought about how they go about making decisions. Garin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Garin. I'm an organisation development consultant, and I basically work with executives, boards and teams on governance and decision management, which basically means, ensuring that organisations are making the right decision at the right time by the right people with the right authority using the right process, and completely in agreement with Dani as well. It's something that organisations could do much better at if they spent some time and invested some thought and investment at all levels with that as well. And an organisation's success is definitely the sum of all the decisions made within an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Garin. So aside from personal interest, why have we chosen decision making? Well, one paper we read when we were looking through all the research for this described organisations as decision factories. So in our non-work lives, the decisions we have to make, the number of decisions have just exploded. So 40 years ago, it's estimated the average supermarket had 9,000 different products for us to choose from. 20 years ago, that had increased to 30,000. And these days, the majority of us are faced with kind of the choice of millions of different products every day. And in organisations, it's estimated that in the last 20 years, the average manager has seen more than a 30-fold increase in the number of decisions they're having to make. And I suspect, given the turbulence of particularly the last 12 months, that will have grown exponentially again. So for most of those day-to-day choices, the risks are small. But when you scale that up to decisions being made on a corporate scale, the implications can be really enormous. And also some recent research by CIPD found that employee satisfaction with their involvement in decision-making in their businesses is significantly and positively related to their overall job satisfaction. So there's a real, human reason to involve people in decision making, but only 50% of employees are currently satisfied with the amount of involvement they've got in decision making. So the science of decision making is really complex, and it draws on kind of many different fields of research. In essence, though, to improve our decision making, we must work on kind of the process we use to make decisions, and also be aware of the psychological factors that are at play as we make decisions. So the point of today's session is to take you through our model of decision making, highlight some of the factors you need to be aware of, and give you some tools you can use in your own work and really help supercharge decision making in your organisation. As we go through the research, we always turn up myths about the topics we're looking at, and decision making's no different. So we've got 3 for you. The first is that decision making's a largely intellectual, objective, rational exercise. We might be tempted to think that's true, but it's just not. So actually, there's kind of social and emotional, political factors that all play a huge part in a decision-making process in an organisation. It's estimated that subjective opinions impact over 95% of all decisions that we make, and that emotions are most responsible for kind of the decision-making errors that occur. There's 185 known cognitive and decision-making biases that can impact us when we're making decisions. We'll take you through some of those today, not all 185, but we'll give you some of the key ones. And even things like the amount of sleep that we get, or the time of day we make decisions, can have an impact. So anything that suppresses levels of serotonin, for example, can make us less risk averse. So if we've had a bad night's sleep, that can really impact how we make decisions.
I was going to say, one of those interesting bits of information that came from that is that, the most active decision-making forms happen in the morning, don't they? And teams actually meet in the later afternoon are more likely to actually defer major decisions because people feel tired and their serotonin levels have gone down.
So our second myth was that we turn to experts to help us make decisions. So that would feel logically intuitively correct, but actually it's not true at all. There's some recent research done that said only 32% of leaders turn to experts. when they've got a decision making, with the vast majority preferring to turn elsewhere when they get stuck. So that's 41% of leaders said they would turn to immediate colleagues and friends. And another 41% said they would use family or relatives to help them. It's worth bearing that in mind if you're in a decision-making situation in an organization, that your leader probably isn't talking to people, experts. It might be his friend, his next door neighbor.
Yeah, and I think we've all been there before when, a senior leaders, they go home at night having spoken with the team in their exposition, and they come back the next day and having spoken to their partner, and often their partner becomes often their counsel, and sometimes it's good counsel, but they don't necessarily have the context, and the information they're getting is sometimes quite biased from the manager that's sharing it with them as well, and that's something that teams really need to be aware of. And for those people that are involved in family firms, it can be frustrating for teams, because where the meetings should be deciding, it's not necessarily happening there, and things are presented as a fait accompli, aren't they?
And then our third and final myth was that senior managers are best placed to make decisions. Actually, the research has shown that involving middle managers, and especially those managers are what they call boundary spanners, so where they've got close links with suppliers, with customers, or they're spanning teams, they make, if you involve those middle managers, then you end up with superior decisions and strategies. And that's because they've got access to more relevant external information, because they're close to the people the decisions are affecting, and they're much more likely to know whether the actions and the decisions you're proposing are actually operationally possible given the resources and context that the organisation is facing. So they were our myths. So now it's time to get into the detail. So we're taking a slightly different approach this time. The last two podcasts we've given you a kind of top 5, but today we're going to run you through 4 phases of our decision-making model. So Garin's going to take us through the first phase. So over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Dani. And I guess just sort of set the context for this. So this is our third podcast that we've done now, and I'd probably say, and Dani, you probably agree with this, is that decision making of all the areas that we've researched has required us to read the most amount of research, because it's difficult to find definitive answers, and a lot of decision making research is based on case study, and therefore with case study it's based on the context. And it's, what can happen is that good decisions can create bad outcomes, and bad decisions can create good outcomes. And really, it's making sure that, we understand the context first before we start to apply our decision-making methodology. Yep. And this is why what we wanted to do today is to give you a decision-making framework, not a method, a framework for you to actually approach decisions. So we've got basically a 4-part approach. So it's really simple. It's the first phase is the what and the why of making the decision. What are we going to decide? Why are we going to decide it? The next bit is the who. So who is actually involved in the decision making, and that means examining ourselves, our personal approach to decision making, groups and considerations around that as well. Then we're going to give you a really tactical section about how. Some really specific techniques that will help you look at things like implications and whatnot, options. And then finally, the really often forgotten part of decisions, which is the what next. So we've produced this amazingly high quality decision. How do we ensure that it's accepted by the people around us, and they actually help execute the decision as well? So let's get into that first one. So in the what and the why, the first thing we would always say is categorize the decision that you have to make. Not all decisions are equal. Some decisions are very straightforward. You can almost set decision-making rules around it, and automate it almost, if this, then that system. Others are much more complex, where we don't actually know what's going to happen until we actually make the decision, because there's all these variables involved. So what we'd recommend often for something like this is something called the Cynefin sort of framework. And it's developed by a thinker called Dave Snowden, and he basically came up with a sense-making framework, and it helps us understand the different problems and decisions that we face. So often what happens is most people decide how they're going to act and then justify the action. What this does is it encourages you to actually sense what's going on, map the territory, and then decide how you're going to decide around it as well. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to sort of give you a high level view of it, you can sort of look at his framework in 2 halves. So the right side is looking at where things are more ordered and cause and effect are predictable. If I decide this, then this will probably most likely happen. And so what we can do is we can actually start to take, a much more straightforward approach to things. So the bottom right corner is about obvious. So this is where we kind of know exactly what's going to happen. So we sense what's happening, we categorize the decision to be made, and we then respond. And we can apply best practice. There is one best way of doing it, and that's where we can set decision rules and automate. The second one on the ordered side is complicated. So we sense it's going to take more analysis to get to the bottom of it, and often we'll use subject matter experts. But with that analysis, we're then able to sort of identify our response, and we can apply good practice. So there's a number of ways of doing it, but we make sure that we actually, apply what is sort of seen to work already. On the left-hand side is where things become unordered and cause and effect are unpredictable. So if you make a decision, we're really not sure of the unintended consequences of what it might cause. So in the top left one is where we have a complex situation. It's where there's unpredictable, uncertain outcomes, and it requires us to actually, rather than sense, for us to actually probe what's going on and run safe to fail experiments in order to really find what's going on, find responses as we sense. And so our answers to this is often, very emergent. We need to get all of the different areas and perspectives and experts into the room and really come up with a solution there as well. And the bottom left, and for those of you that were manning during sort of March and April last year, will be very aware this is chaotic. It's where we generally don't know what's going on. And so in order to bring order, we just have to act, and then we sense, and then we respond. So the way in which we respond is often quite novel. So a lot of leaders were making very quick decisions during that time. Interestingly, organizations can either fall into the chaotic area accidentally, sometimes even intentionally, to create chaos, to create change. And a good example of organizations doing that is things like hackathons as well. So that's the Cynefin method. It's a really useful framework for managers too. Managers generally live in the complex and complicated world. The other thing you need to think about as you're starting to think of the what and the why when you're making decisions is to, number one, is just understand the strategy. Number one is read it. It never continues to amaze me how many managers have not read and understood the strategy. When we do strategic alignment training in organizations, we'll often ask 15 managers, how many of you have actually read the strategy? And 2 or 3 will put their hands up. So it's really important to take responsibility and read the business plans of other departments, to read the strategy, and to understand how that influences your decisions, the level of risk that's wanted to be take, the things that you need to prioritize above other things. And sometimes strategies aren't very clear. So what we really encourage to do is to speak with your senior managers and with your colleagues, and even the most senior of managers, your CEO, and ask questions, and that can really help guide you in terms of where you begin with your decisions and the first steps to take.
And the other thing that's kind of organization specific is around culture. So it's not that surprising that cultural context really influences decision making processes in all sorts of ways, some really obvious and others less so. So the levels of trust that are placed in people, the power and hierarchy structures, the organization's tolerance for risk, whether you're looking at whether there's an organization that focuses on the short term versus the long term, and all of those sorts of things can play a part. But culture can also affect when and how decisions are made and determine the speed at which they're made. Culture determines what information is considered valuable, how information is interpreted, and how people are making sense of events. I think it's also, in terms of culture, it's also important to recognise that managers will be influenced by previous decisions. So decisions that have been made before they're even involved in the organisation, and their outcomes and the extent to which they kind of form part of the memory of the organisation. They'll likely either be in policies or procedures or rules, or in the individual or collective memories of those involved in your current decision-making process. So you can find those sorts of things can either help the process or constrain it. It might perpetuate the status quo and people might be reluctant to change things. Culture can also determine whether you're expected as a manager to make decisions independently without consulting others, or whether consulting with others is kind of desired and expected. If your culture is really collaborative, then you might be expected to involve people in decision-making processes in a much different way to you've been used to. So
yeah, it's really interesting. You can often tell what kind of culture you have by sitting in the senior leadership team meeting and looking at the decisions that they're making. And often if you have things like an avoidance culture, within the organization, you'll see lots of decisions that should have been made at a lower level that find their way into the senior leadership team meeting, and it actually holds the meeting back. Rather than them focused on the really important strategic issues and prioritizing for the organization, they're caught in the nitty-gritty operational stuff.
Yeah. So the other area to think about is corporate values. So corporate values can evoke mixed responses in people. Some people think they're the most important thing ever, others a lot less convinced. And certainly if your values are just a nice list of words on a wall or created as part of a marketing exercise, and then tend to agree they're probably not that important. But where an organisation has really done the work and really surfaced their core values, and they've got this fundamental set of principles that they adhere to, then those values can really act as a North Star and play a really significant role in helping guide decision making at all levels of organisations. So if they're really true core values, then they'll provide a framework for making difficult decisions. They'll help you, when resources are scarce, they help you know how to allocate these resources, and when you're choosing a strategic partner to work with, they'll help you determine who's the right strategic partner. So there's a number of researchers that strongly argue that organizational values really shape kind of the decisions you made, but also the problems that are presented for decision making. Worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about the context of decision making. So the last part of our kind of why of organizational decision making is all around information. Most decisions involve a mix of opinions, kind of your own and others, and facts, and sifting through all that data can be a real challenge, but it's also a really important part of a decision making process. So there's two kind of poles really. First, information overload is a real problem for organizations. So organizations today have got access to unlimited amounts of data: sales, demographics, economic trends, competitive data, consumer behavior, data about your people, efficiency measures, finance. The list is endless. And one of the phrases that popped up when we were doing the research was the idea that organizations are drowning in data whilst thirsting for information. We pulled out some research that found that businesses currently analyze less than 7% of the data that they collect. They're also generating data at a much faster rate than any manager can master. And in parallel, the useful life of the data that they're gathering is collapsing as the world around them is changing really quickly. So it's really easy to get data, but it's increasingly difficult to convert that into meaningful information to aid decision making. And then at the opposite extreme, you've got information organizations experiencing kind of poverty of information, either through a lack of data or, more often or not, the lack of time or capability to find and understand the information they need. So we've got just a few tips on how to make the most effective use of data when we're making decisions. And a big part of that is being structured about how you're going to work with the data and information you've got. So first up, be clear on the problem you're seeking to solve, or the decision you're trying to make. Then work out what types of information you need to help you make that decision, and try to do that without being sidetracked by the data that's easily available, as that can distort what you can find out. Make sure you assess the quality of the data you're using. There's always issues with data sources. None of them are perfect. It's important you understand how the data was collected, what it was collected for, when it was collected, and generally how much trust you can put in the data that you've got. And then lastly, look out for information that's kind of actually opinion disguised as fact. So always ask for the evidence. Opinions are really useful inputs into a decision-making process, but you need to know their opinions and not confuse them with facts. So look out for people saying things like everyone knows, or people are saying that, or I've met several people who, and just be a bit more curious and probe what's being said.
There's a real skill in the curation of information that's required for an interview. I think sometimes what happens is, if a decision's being made and the order's given out to some technical specialist, go and get me some information, it's just, there's a lot of information because they don't want to leave the wrong thing out. And so when you do see things like board packs or spreadsheets, it's often piles of raw data which the manager just doesn't have the concentration levels, the time, or the focus to actually to go through, and so it kind of gets lost and then starts to rely on sort of heuristics. There's a lot of things that could be done where you actually ask for the interpretation of the specialist, and that helps them because it helps them be more commercial or more service orientated, because you're actually asking them to bring some good analysis, and it also can really sort of streamline the process as well, can't it?
It can, absolutely. And if you're going to involve experts, let them do their job and let them kind of apply their expert knowledge and kind of insights to the data in front of you. So just lastly on information, there's just a bias that's important to be aware of, and that's confirmation bias. Sometimes we refer to it as anchoring bias, and that describes our kind of underlying tendency to notice and focus and give greater credence to evidence that fits with our existing beliefs. So as soon as we've got an idea in our head, our brain starts to look for evidence to confirm it. And actually, at the same time, it starts filtering out any evidence that's that's going to go contrary to that. So we form our mental models really rapidly, often on the basis of limited information, but we're really slow to alter them as new facts emerge. It's important to be aware of that. And what do we do about it? Well, the first step is just being aware that it's a problem. Have discussions with people involved in decision making about the fact that confirmation bias might emerge, when it's likely to show up, and concentrate really hard on trying to establish a neutral fact base. Get several parties to gather the information so you've got an objective data set, and make sure that all the facts get an airing before you start making decisions.
Oh, that's so powerful, isn't it? If you can go into a decision making process with, okay, well, this is what we agree with before we go into it, that can make a huge difference, can't it?
Yeah, it can. It's so important. So that was our phase one. That's looking at the context, the what and the who, the what and the why, and deciding how to decide, categorizing your decision, aligning with organizational strategy, and taking into account culture, values, and information. So now we're on to kind of the second part, which is about who needs to be involved. So Garin, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah. So, and I think it's kind of starting with the end in mind with this bit. Where often you find sort of decisions falling down is sort of when we go into the execution part, is because stakeholders, and when we say stakeholders, it could be anyone. It could be someone further down the process. It could be people that have authority or will actually be executing on it. They just don't know you've made the decision, or they have information that would actually mean that if that was known at the time, you wouldn't have made that decision. So really, it's important when you actually go through that decision making process about how you're going to do it, is decide how you're going to engage with your stakeholders. And there's a spectrum from inform over here. So all you're going to do is just inform that you're making a decision, educate them about what you're doing. Then it goes over to consult, where you start to specifically go out to different stakeholder groups, gather information, views. Then you kind of got the mid-level, where you're actually having dialogue and talking it through and getting a shared understanding before you actually start to lead that decision-making process, to the more collaborative areas. So that we've got collaboration, where you're kind of sort of framing the issues together with your stakeholders, and you're actually debating the options together as well. So it's the higher quality solutions that you come into. And then finally, the most collaborative, which is partnering, where you're actually working with your stakeholders to, frame the issue, select and implement solutions together. What you could argue is that on this side, these are quicker, and these take longer, but the execution strangely actually works over this side much more, because it just means that you do it once and you do it right and everyone's bought into it as well. So it's really important to think about how you're going to do it. There is a phrase that managers sometimes use, which was it stop until apprehended? No, was it?
Seek forgiveness, not permission.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the one. It's a very machismo kind of phrase, isn't it? And I guess that it does work, if you're in a highly bureaucratic organization, but it's not a heuristic that works in every situation. Really important to know, that you people feel included in your decisions, and it's really important that staff feel included in decisions as well, isn't it, Dani?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of research out there that if you involve your staff in decision making, then you just have a happier, more effective workforce. And I think going back to that seeking permission, seeking forgiveness, not permission, is that difference. We've talked about it before, the difference between disruption and skillful disruption. If you run around making lots of decisions, you can create a lot of disruption, but you can also create a lot of damage. If you take a bit of time to think about how you're going to do it, it can be a lot more constructive.
Yes, because we've all been on the receiving end of those things, and it very rarely ends well. And then we're going to look at ourselves as individuals, because we do bring our own perspectives in decision making. As Dani was saying, 95% of decisions are subjective, and so two researchers, Simon and March, have argued basically that humans, when it comes to decisions, actually satisfice. And satisfice basically is means to, rather than optimize, we actually look for alternatives only to the point where we find an acceptable solution. So we're not looking for the perfectly optimal solution. And because we have to make so many decisions, an organization of 50,000 people makes 400 million decisions per day. So it's not possible to do that level of analysis. So we employ things like heuristics and rules of thumb to actually make decisions. And most of the time, our shortcuts do serve us well, but what it also leaves us prone to is our sort of cognitive limitations in leading to errors in judgment. And smart people can make very poor decisions. Often poor decisions are not due to a lack of intelligence, it's because we've got some form of a bias. And these systematic mistakes are often called cognitive biases, these decision-making traps that we fall into again and again. So the first one is overconfidence bias. Now, Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning researcher into this field, said if he could eliminate one bias, it would be this one. And it's prevalent through all the population. Around 80% of the population at any one time will exhibit optimistic bias. What it shows basically that things like even physicians are overly optimistic in their diagnosis. It can show up in terms of how we believe an outcome is going to happen. So if we think that a product is actually going to be successful, whereas we actually compare it to the number of new products that do actually succeed, you can see there's a massive mismatch. And also that people often believe that they're above average. And so that kind of sort of again shows to you that we often overestimate our ability. So the second cognitive bias that we want to talk about is just the recency effect. So it's also known as the availability bias. It's just that we tend to place too much emphasis on information and evidence that is kind of readily available around us right now, or our most recent experience. So if we're on a hot streak, if our sales team are doing really well, we often have that kind of thing of our decisions are good. We don't need to be to form too much analysis, for example. Really well-known example of this is in the 90s, there was an Everest expedition where two parties led by two experienced leaders made a go for the summit when they knew that the weather conditions weren't good. But because the tour leaders had experienced a consistent amount of good weather in the last few seasons, they actually believed that they could do it. There's also a little bit of summit fever, which is another bias that we won't mention now, but it was a belief that was their experience, whereas mountaineers that had been doing it in the 80s had spent years not being able to get to the summit. And so they were a lot more risk averse. So it's just basically making sure that when we look at our data, that we go back in time further than maybe the most recent past. So what can we do to actually work around those kind of biases? Because biases are really hard baked into us. It's very difficult to sort of overcome them. Well, research has shown that even basic training in probability can make us better forecasters. It's shown that it helps create 50% faster decisions and 40% higher quality decisions and better execution. And so, just by presenting to your team, again, another challenge that managers can have is that they present their ideas with such confidence and such certainty that the team are just like, well, I've got some concerns about it, but who am I to challenge that? So as a manager, if you can present an idea with probability, like you believe that it's got a 70% probability of working, then that introduces 30% of that it might not. And that gives your team a really good opportunity to talk those kind of things through. And that can give you a much more richer conversation where you start to actually really start putting some constraints around the decision to make sure you don't stray into areas that could potentially make you fail.
Yeah, there was some really nice research done by, I think it was the Rotterdam School of Management, where they looked at projects and they found that projects run by junior managers were more successful than those run by senior managers. And that was attributed to the fact that people were much more willing to share their ideas and challenge the junior managers leading the projects than they were with senior managers. The overconfidence of, and that willingness to listen to senior people can be a real problem in decision making.
Yeah, and again, there's some other research, and I can't quote it precisely, but if anyone wants to write in the comments, and it's just that the people that are older use less evidence to make decisions. And that could be for a variety of reasons, but it often is because they've got that kind of, what is our next thing is intuition, sort of at play. And again, it would be amiss of us not to do a section on this without talking about the role of intuition. So number 4, it's about understanding that intuition is something that we use a lot in decision making. And so what is it? It's about pattern recognition and pattern matching based on our past experience. And the psychologist Gary Klein has done some great research on this, particularly in the military, and looking at how decisions are made and the use of intuition and when it's most effective and when it's least effective. Often the argument is that if you're more experienced, then you should rely on intuition more. If you're less experienced, then your intuition doesn't have so many past experiences to come up with. So therefore, there's a greater need for analysis as well. The most important thing with intuition, though, is to show your workings so that your team understand the rationale behind it and it makes sense to them, so that when you're giving them instructions, they can understand the intent behind it and they're more likely to follow it as well, rather than thinking, how on earth did the manager come up with that idea over there? How on earth are we going to follow that? There are lots of different things you can do to actually help support that intuition. It does have a role to play. We're not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing, but it's good to have like in all things, to have balance. So one good way is to apply disciplined intuition. So again, a little bit of research that Daniel Kahneman did, which was what was really useful, is to actually do the analysis first and then apply the intuition. And then that intuition has got a much more sort of specific container to work in. And another way of doing it is to actually do things like pre-mortem exercises. So you probably know these quite well, but it's where we actually, when we make a decision prior to that, we just work through, if this decision was to go wrong, why would it have gone wrong? And that can really start to help us understand some analysis as well. Another really good scholar is Carl Weick, and he came up with a really nice way to explain the intuitions that you have as a manager to your teams. And he came up with a very simple 5-step process, which I quite like, which is you go to your team when you've made your intuitive decision and you share with the number one, okay, here's what I think we face. So it's your assessment of the situation. Number 2, here's what I think we should do. So that's what your intuitive thought is. 3, here's why, your rationale. 4, here's what we should keep our eye on. So these are the things that might be risks to the project. Number 5 is, okay, so that's what I think. Now talk to me, or have a facilitated discussion in pairs amongst yourselves, and then come back to me and tell me, am I right? Am I wrong? What do you think? What the risks are? And that can lead to a much better conversation and rapidly increase the chances of buy-in as well.
Lovely, thanks, Garin. So the other thing, when you're making decisions in an organisation, a lot of the time you're going to be making a decision in a group setting, and there's lots of research out there to show that overall, on average, groups tend to make better, more considered decisions than individuals, and the idea that 2 heads are better than 1 is fairly widespread, and the research backs that up for most cases. In part, it's about getting a more diverse set of perspectives and ideas and ways of thinking, and also that it just tends to be seen as fairer and more democratic if you've used a group to help you make the decision. But superiority of groups is not a given. It brings with it different risks and challenges, and can be an area where many organisations struggle to make it work. And that social nature of group decision making means you're adding a huge number of additional variables into the mix. So yes, you've got 185 cognitive biases out there. You need to multiply that by the number of people you've got in your group. So times 6 or 10 or that sort of thing. So as things get more things get much more complex when we're looking at interactive kind of type of group decision making. And Peter Drucker back in the 1960s said the first rule of decision making is that you don't make a decision unless there's disagreement. So that idea that challenge and perspective is good, but it's about balancing that so it's constructive disagreement rather than unhealthy conflict that you end up involved in. So there's some tips for how you make group decision making more effective. And the first up is about how you frame the decision making process. So cognitive research has shown consistently that how you talk about a decision or a situation and how you frame it can really change how people respond and react to that situation. So as a manager leading a decision making process, this gives you a real opportunity. So if you frame a decision making process as a negotiation, then people are going to go into that process with one mindset, and it's more likely they're going to try and get their position supported or go in thinking they need to argue their corner or defend their ideas. If you queue up the group on the idea that it's about cohesion, it's about unity, or it's about making the most accurate decision, then people will go into it with a different mindset, and they're more likely to take time to explore all the information, surface different opinions, and reach a shared decision rather than just fight their own corner.
And that sort of talks to prospect theory as well, which is how the language that you use a manager to actually frame it has a critical factor. If you frame it as a threat, i.e. the classic burning platform, what you often get is a lot of resource thrown at it, but it reduces creativity substantially. So it's really good for managers to actually frame the problem in multiple ways to give the group a chance to look at it from different perspectives, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing, is to pay attention to group dynamics and group process when you've got group decision making going on. So first up, have you got the right people in the room? So this is a little bit what we talked about earlier with stakeholders. Make sure you've got the people who need to be involved. It can be a bit tempting to exclude those. You've got a difficult person, but don't miss a really valuable opportunity to hear their perspectives. And if they're going to play any part in rolling out the decision later on, involve them earlier rather than later. So
as a very outspoken manager once said to me, it's better to have them peeing out the tent than in the tent. I think that's probably a metaphor we can all identify with.
Absolutely, yeah. Second up, do people know why they're involved? How often do people get involved in a process or a meeting and they're not really clear why they're there. So just make sure that everybody knows what decision needs to be made, what their contribution to that is. And it sounds really obvious, but unspoken differences in understanding can really send your discussions and process off track before you've even started. The other thing around group dynamics and group process is an important bias to be aware of, and that's something known as the common knowledge effect. So the idea that information that's shared amongst the group will dominate the discussion. So people spend a lot of time telling each other things they all know. So if the information is known by everybody in the room, that will dominate the discussion. We'll spend much more time talking about that than surfacing the information that might just be held by one person. It's, you need to create a forum where people have that time and space to bring forward the knowledge that only they know, and make sure the group really understands that the whole purpose of that is to raise the discussion is to raise the overall knowledge of the team. Have a leader who's setting up a norm of information sharing, who encourages people to kind of stimulate information exchange and go through the process, and make sure you lay out all the information before the decision gets made. The other part of group process is to ensure good dialogue and discussion. So I know you found some research, didn't you, Garin, about the importance of dialogue in decision-making processes?
Yeah, McKinsey's have found that when it comes to effective decisions, the biggest contributor to effective decisions, 53% is dialogue. Like information is 8%, but it's that discussion around the information that makes the critical factor.
Yeah, absolutely. So dialogue's not just about getting agreement, it's about encouraging people to participate in kind of creating a pooled share of meaning, which leads to aligned action. So things, how things are framed and how they're talked about become a significant context for shaping how people think about and respond to a situation. So on a really simplistic level, the idea of that glass half full, glass half empty, how you frame a situation, how you talk about it, generates the reactions, the responses that follow. And that in any group, you're going to have multiple realities. So everybody's going to have their own story or their own narrative or their own mindset that they're applying to a situation. People are bringing their own kind of histories with the topic, and what they've experienced in the past and how they see the present will really affect what they say.
Yeah, and if you sort of go full circle back to the Cynefin model.
Yeah, and I think especially if you're a manager walking into a new situation or you're leading a decision-making process, it's really important to recognise that it's unlikely that this formal decision-making process you're kicking off is the first time this particular issue will have been discussed. You're not going to be starting with a blank slate. You're entering a stream of conversations that have been going on for some time. So it's really important to get a sense of those discussions before and during the process. What do people know? Honour and acknowledge the past. It's really important that people feel the past and the history is recognised. I mean, obviously, don't let it dominate the debate, but it's really important that people feel that that's being acknowledged.
Yeah, and some decisions are taboo. Like we've just made a collective unconscious decision to never discuss this.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand what those things are. You absolutely need to, clean house and sort these things out, but you need to understand what those things are, don't you?
Yeah, you do. I mean, Bob Marshak talks about this really quite nicely. He talks about there's things on the table, so there's things that people feel can and should be discussed. There's things under the table that people know you ought to be talking about, but they're reluctant to go there and they're scared to bring it up. And then there's things he describes as over the table, so that's kind of things like dreams and values and unspoken hopes. So that's a really nice way of looking at it.
As consultants, we're just so acutely aware of this because it can provoke extraordinary reactions of people, can't it? So that's why we would say 95% of the predictor of success is the preparation for decision making, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then just one final point, we won't labour it because we talked about it in podcast 2, and that's about, are people willing to say what they really think and feel? Have you created psychological safety for that group that are making the decision process? So that's given us some really good insights into the people-related dynamics around decision making. So now we want to get to the kind of get practical and give you some tools to help you actually make decisions. So Garin, do you want to take us through that?
Great, absolutely. So we're going to get super tactical now. So what we're going to give you are 5 explicit techniques to support you during decision making. Now, it's really important to remember that they are tools. They will not give you the definitive answer, but what they do is that they will contribute to that 53% of dialogue being much more meaningful, much more focused, and much more robust in terms of a process as well. So there's 5 things that we've kind of agreed so far, which is the 5 C's of decision making. So we've looked at composition, so who should be involved in the decision making process. We've identified the context, so what's the type of decision we're going to make. We've looked at communication, so how are we going to use dialogue to come to a conclusion. We've looked at control as the leader. How are you going to control the process and who has decision-making rights? And then we've also looked at categorizing the decision as well. So in terms of the first tactical thing is something that teams often overlook but could easily remedy. And that's just this very simple thing of generating options. Often I've sat in leadership meetings or team meetings and someone presents something and the option literally is, are we going to do it or not?
Mm.
That doesn't lead itself to an expansive conversation, and it often brings group dynamics into play, because if you're the person that maybe in the past you've disagreed with a few things but you see holes in it and the group have got overconfidence bias, it takes a lot for you to actually say that maybe we shouldn't do this because you're just like being seen as a stick in the mud, or you're not on the bus, or whatever it is that they want to describe you as. And so people censor themselves, and so we just end up with these kind of decisions that should never have even seen the light of day as well. So always look, 3 vendors, 4, 5, whatever it is, to have choice and to explore it, and you can compare like for like as well. And even if you can't be in a choice where you're choosing 3 different vendors to choose from, then at least there's 3 other options you can have, which is the option to expand. So actually to go really big on this decision, really double down or triple down on your current decision at some point. The option to delay. So we are going to do it, but we're just not going to do it now. Can also be a really rich conversation that creates. Or the option to just abandon it and to actually explore another avenue. And if you introduce those things, then again, you're really encouraging the team to have a very thought through conversation around that as well.
Yeah. The other technique I read about was just consider the next adjacent possibility. So if you're really struggling to come up with an option, just think what's the thing in the next square across that we could do, just if people need something to help them get going with option generation.
100%. That's a really nice idea. Yeah, simplicity is sometimes key, and I really like that. The option number 2 is work up your options. Work them through. Like what do these actually mean? So rather than just because you're often presenting your idea to generalists or people that don't have expertise in your domain. It's your job to educate them about what this looks like. What are your assumptions? What's the payback? How does this play through? So a really nice tool for this is something called a decision tree. So if you've got option 1 and option 2 on the screen, we're just showing you like for a very simple thing, if you're going to take a lease on your office of 12 months or 24 months, and then it's just some very simple calculations that start to work it through so that people can actually see, what is the end sum and what do these 2 different scenarios work out to be as well. That makes so much more informed decision. I sit in a lot of trustee meetings, and trustees have the hardest job in the world. They meet quarterly. They're not experts in the charity. They don't know that much about what's going on, and then they have these decisions come on saying, do we do it or not? And there's very little calculation about it, and that's why often governance is seen as a challenge. Number 3, and really important, is to set and evaluate your decision-making criteria. So if we're in gut feel, we're kind of making these intuitive decisions. This is about bringing to the light of day what are the specific things which we base this decision on. And so there's a process to follow. So a tool of doing it, and there's lots of others, but this one is a common technique, and it works well. I use it a lot with groups in coaching for individuals with major decisions, and that's the trade-off analysis. You might also know it as the decision matrix analysis. The first thing you do, identify your options. Then you identify your criteria. It could be 4, 5, 6 criteria upon which you're going to base your decision. And not all criteria equal. So what you do then is you invite the group in to have a really good discussion where you then actually give them a weight. So it could be 5 is the most important, 1 is least important. And that discussion is really rich because that's you as a group working through it as an option, decide what's most important. And don't go down for consensus where it's like we all agree that everything's 5, because that's not going to lend itself. You've seen that before, haven't you, Dani?
I have, and I think it's particularly true when you've got functional heads who, the criteria broadly aligned to their functional responsibilities, and they're kind of trying to argue that their thing's the same priority, and you're really dodging the important conversation if you let people get away with grading all the criteria as equal. You need to push the group to really challenge themselves and each other on what are the really critical decision making criteria that we need to weight more heavily.
And also when you've got those different, one of the things it's always challenging for managers, and this is probably for a session in the future, is to encourage enterprise thinking, not departmental thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
So then we go through a process of scoring each option across those criteria. You then calculate your weighted scores, and it then gives you an arbitrary number. You can then apply your intuition over the top of that, and then you're really starting to get into some really good thought in terms of what it looks like. The fourth one, which is really important, and again, this is a real weak spot for a lot of organizations, is to actually think of the implications, to really think of the second order effects of what might happen as a result of this. Often as we've got a pain or an anxiety on our desk and we just want it off, quick decision, but we don't think through what might happen in a month, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. What's the opportunity cost? What if something else comes along? So it's really having a framework to do it. And a really nice tool for that is basically it's the PMI table. And PMI stands for plus minus implications. Really simple. You write your table for each option, your pluses, all the pluses that come from it, all the minuses, and all the implications that you can think of. And the implications can be plus or minus. And then again, score the concepts, calculate the totals, and then that gives you an arbitrary number to care. So again, it would have really invited your team into exploring what it looks like as well. And then building on the Cynefin model that we looked at earlier, and similar to like the agile methodology, is the idea of experiment. And this is where we've got complex problems. We genuinely don't know what's going to happen. Like we launch a product and we really generally, until the market start to consume our product or not, we don't know. So what we do is we actually start to run low risk or safe to fail experiments. I think Jim Collins quite nicely put it as firing bullets, then cannonballs. So it's kind of low risk, low distraction experiments. And the whole product management field has really mastered this. And I think that's something that, other fields could really benefit from, actually understanding how they do it. For example, Strategize is a really nice sort of school of thought. They've got some really nice collateral, and they've identified 44 experiments that you can do to make sure that your ideas are feasible, viable, and desirable. And so what it does is it reduces uncertainty before you actually fully commit.
So that's got us to the point where we've made our decisions. So we might think the work's over, but actually the last phase is probably potentially the most tricky part. So that's implementation. So you've put all that effort into making decisions, and that can be wasted if you don't give enough time to deciding how to roll out your decision. So leaders not only have to make good decisions, they will have to be able to implement them effectively. And the process we've used to make decisions often has a great impact on whether we can actually do that implementation successfully. So I was reading the CIPD report on the employee engagement that came out, I think, last month, and that found that the perceived fairness, consistency, accuracy, and openness of decision making was really strongly associated with employee commitment and identification to an organisation. And that in itself was a predictor of how much discretionary effort employees put in. And it also influenced things like staff turnover, job satisfaction, employee well-being, and attitude. So getting the decision-making process right is so important.
It's really powerful stuff, isn't it? Like
really powerful stuff.
Like you have to get this bit right. It doesn't matter how good your decision is if you get this bit wrong.
Yeah, you've wasted a lot of effort and a lot of time. So for this last section of the webcast, we're going to look at two key elements of decision implementation. And the first one's around procedural justice, and then the second one's around communicating decision. So first up's procedural justice. So by procedural justice, we mean it's about the fairness and transparency of the process you've used to reach a decision. And you need to pay attention to two things. First up, was the process fair and transparent? So if people perceive the decision was preordained and think the process was just an exercise in paying lip service to consultation and collaboration, I think we've all been there, then they're much less likely to buy into the decision that's been reached. And then the second thing you need to pay attention to around procedural justice is, do people believe the process? Do they perceive the process as fair and transparent? So there's really limited value in investing time and effort in a fair collaborative decision-making process if people just don't understand how you've gone about it, or they weren't aware that what the process had been followed. And I think that's especially important if your organisation has got a history of decision making that's been perceived as unfair. You have to work so much harder to change people's perceptions of that. Even if you run a super transparent, super fair process, people will have perceptions about how things have been done in the past, and they'll bring that forward. So it's really important as leaders, we're testing for alignment between our views of and perceptions of the process and how the people involved in the process and people around the process see it. At times leaders think the process was fair and legitimate, but their team members have got a really different idea, and that can be quite problematic. So what are the components of fair process? Well, we've talked about some of them. So, make sure you share information equally with everybody involved, really ramp up the openness and transparency as you go through, avoid including token alternatives. So people will spot that a mile off. If there's an option in there that's just for show, people will see it. So just don't go there. And help people separate advocacy from analysis. So give them time and space to consider the analysis and weigh up the options before they get into championing a position or an idea. Recognise that conflict in the decision process and that need for procedural justice and legitimacy aren't at odds with one another. In fact, you enhance that perception of justice and legitimacy if you give people an opportunity not only to air their views, but also debate them with others in an open and transparent environment. So, and people must feel that, sorry, Garin.
I know, I said, and I guess there's a skill there for managers as well, is to make sure that you do encourage discussion and the exchange of views, but you don't have the perception of winners and losers. It's just that we are trying to do this for the better good and we're exchanging views. That's quite critical, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can kind of take that, it's a bit cliche, but that win-win attitude, then you're gonna make your life a lot easier if everybody comes away feeling heard and feeling that their position has been understood and taken into account. So people need to believe that their leaders listen to them, consider their views seriously before taking a decision, even if the decision doesn't go the way people were hoping. If people really feel that they've been listened to and taken seriously, then that can go a long way to helping. So in some, people care about processes and not just outcomes when it comes to decision making. Garin, do you want to talk to us about communicating the decision?
Yeah, and again, this is something that's really straightforward. Managers are very busy, and very action orientated, and often in that kind of firefighting mode. The decision's made, and then you move on from it as well. But there really needs to be some governance around decisions as well, and to make sure that. So just some very simple things to think about is frequency. Like, you've communicated your decision. How are you going to communicate it out? What mediums, channels are you going to use? PDF, discussion, town hall, slide deck, both audio, video, whatever it is. How often are you going to check in on that meeting? And also check in on the people that you've made the decision with, to show that it's still important. And how do you actually keep them informed that you're making progress? Are you going to do it a couple of times a year? You're going to do it in the quarterly business review? Are you going to do it monthly? I was listening to the CEO at Google, and when he has an issue and the decision to be made, he makes people meet daily about it to show that he sees it as being really important. In the communications, it's really important to provide the big picture, how it relates to the strategy, to give it meaning, but to give it credibility as well, and to make it meaningful for people to actually be doing this, rather than thinking, oh, that's just your pet project. Also, like I said, relating it to the strategy and talking about how it aligns to other departmental goals. I think that's really important. And sometimes your decision will make other people's lives more difficult and stop them achieving their goals, and they'll have to put their priorities down in order to achieve it. Let's be realistic here. That is often brushed under the carpet, and someone has to shake the magic time tree and bring some time out of somewhere to actually make this happen. We need to have a really honest, grown-up discussion about this and explain the sequence and how it's going to work. Front up with your other manager from the other department and talk about it. We've agreed this together. And what's also really important is explain the trade-offs in your decision. I see this a lot with organizational restructure. It's like, this is it, this is going to work, but no organization restructure is perfect. It's all a trade-off. If you explain to people, these are the trades, so this is what's going to help, and this is what it's going to create negatively. We have to find a way to work with it. That gets a lot more buy-in, rather than people having chats on WhatsApp or Messenger or whatever, talking about how it's not working. Got to talk about this and lean into it as well. Follow-up is key. Making sure that you've got goals, you're tracking the progress, you're celebrating the success of achievement of milestones. You've got to keep paying attention to it, or it will become a fad. Something I see a lot with acquisitions, so much effort goes into the due diligence and the purchase and that as well. And then it comes into the mundane operationalization, and the managers have gone off somewhere else, and these poor people are left with it to actually implement. The manager's got to stay there and stay with it and still make time as well. put a plan, put a structure in place, make it public, be clear, track progress, ask questions, be accountable, show the accountabilities. And then the other thing as well is to feedback and review. Often if a manager's made a bad decision, they just don't want to talk about it because it looks bad on their career. But everyone talks about it, and it is held against you the next time it's done. Managers can actually get away with making poor decisions if they learn from it, and can actually get more respect and more credibility as well. So have feedback sessions, and also really importantly, review the processes of decision making, and also review the options. How did the other options play out? Option B might have actually turned out much better. That's okay. We learn from it. That's how organizations get better and better. But it's really important to remember that decision making is a muscle. The first time we do it as a team, it's often really clunky. It can be, quite tiring as well. We build the muscle. We do it every day. We work out every day, and eventually we just become much better. It's like a competence as well. So again, it's a really critical area. It is overlooked, but it's very easily remedied.
Lovely. Thanks, Garin. So that's it. That's our 4 models, the 4 phases of our model. So just a quick recap. Phase 1 was about the what and the why. So that's all about the context and categorizing the decision. Phase 2 was about the who needs to be involved, and how do we manage the people dynamics. Phase 3 was about the how. So what tools can we use to help surface options and weigh them up. And then phase 4, which we've just done, was about what's next. So how do you implement and communicate your decision? As always, we like to leave you with 3 specific actions. So we've given you a lot of information, but if there were 3 things that we could get you to kind of go away and do straight away, these are the things. So over to you, Garin, for number 1.
Number 1, really simple. Upfront, decide the process. Just be really clear and communicate it and stick to it.
So number 2 is be aware of bias. Be aware that bias might come into play, and deliberately explore what biases might pop up and when you might see them, and think through how you might mitigate them, and make sure everybody involved in the process knows that bias might play a part.
And it's very difficult to choose the third one, but the one I'll probably go for is use tools to support you to generate good conversations. So use it to generate options, use it to agree your decision-making criteria, and use it to explore the implications before you actually make the decision.
Lovely, thank you. So that's the end of our session on decision making. So we'd love to hear your feedback, and if you've got any ideas for content for future sessions, then we're all ears, and we're willing to kind of look at that. Our next session's on well-being. So if you've watched this on YouTube, then we really appreciate you giving it a like, and if you click on the subscribe bell, you'll get notified when the next session's ready to watch. So huge thank you for watching with us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Brilliant, thanks so much.
Thank you.